Well, hello everybody and welcome back to the second part in our tutorial series. We're making a cabin in the woods. That's our plan for today. So we're going to be going through these 6 steps. We're importing an asset from the asset store. We're going to be sculpting and modifying terrain. We're going to be using a cabin asset that we've downloaded, adding that into our environment and resculpting the terrain as necessary, adding a skybox to our environment and explaining what a skybox is, adding textures and foliage, which is adding a bit of detail to our scene, and then we're going to be placing props. This should hopefully be under half an hour, giving you guys about an hour or so to actually complete the activity. You'll notice there's no code in this exercise and there's also no first person character. This is not going to be a game that a player will be able to play. This is about purely building an environment that we could then build on top of in the future. So let's crack on with it. First thing we're going to be doing is open Unity Hub and we're going to be creating a project called Cabin in the Woods. I've already kind of jumped the gun here, but again, just to show you what I'm expecting, create a new project. We'll be using the 3D core here rather than the URP we were using previously. 3D core. Make sure the location is set to your source and repos folder, which should be on your C drive, in your users, your user ID, and then source and then repos in there. If you haven't already got that, remember you'll need to open Visual Studio and sign into Visual Studio, which will create that folder location. So I'm going to call this Cabin in the Woods. I do already have one created, but you just type in Cabin in the Woods and that's what you're going to name. Okay. Once you've created your project, what will happen is Unity will open up. So what we've got here at the moment is our project that we're looking to work with. I've just got a simple main camera and a directional light in here in the scene, nothing exciting. I have already added an asset to this scene and I'm going to show you how we add that. So for our first step, we're going to be importing the cabin environment from the asset store. So to do that, window and asset store. It will again sign you in and we're searching for cabin or cabin environment. That's what we're looking for. I'm just searching for the word cabin. Remember, it'll take a while it signs you in. So I'm searching for the word cabin and I'm interested in only 3 assets. It's the cabin environment, which is this one here. That's what you want. Give that a click. You should have the option to download, import, open in Unity, or whatever it is that it says. This asset comes with quite a lot of key features that we're going to use. Worth remembering as well, when you do import that asset and you press open in Unity, the package manager will open up in Unity, highlighting the package that you want. You should then be able to download. There should be a download button up here in the top right, and once that's finished downloading, press import, and then you'll have an option for all the things you want to import and just press import or import all. I'm not doing that. I've already prepared it because on my machine it's taking forever to load my full list of all the assets I've downloaded in the past. You can see it's still going. Something's gone horribly wrong. So once that's complete, you'll see that cabin will have appeared down here as well as this terrain folder, so you can close down the package manager and we can go from there. Again, we're not building a playable game today. Today it's purely about making assets. So once you've done that, we have completed that first step. Next thing, we're going to be looking at terrain. So we're going to sculpt a terrain for our asset to go on. In order to see our assets, we can go in the cabin folder, we can go in the prefabs folder, and you can see the assets that are included within this package. We've got the cabin itself. If I drag and drop that in, you can see that. Remember, right mouse click and WASD to navigate around. It's a nice, sparse, empty cabin, but we need a floor and a terrain for it to go on. We've got other assets as well, which we're going to be populating later on. I'm not interested in them, so I'm going to select all of those things and just delete them for now. We need a floor for our cabin to go on to. To do that, I want you to go to Game Object, 3D Object, and Terrain. This will create a very, very large checkerboard pattern. When I say large, that's 1000 by 1000 units, so 1000 of these little squares. And remember, in Unity, 1 unit represents 1 meter. As a rough rule of thumb, I'm about 2 meters tall, so imagine me lying down, that's kind of 2 of those. There is an issue though. We like putting the middle of our world in the middle of our map. And the position of this is currently 0, 0, 0, which you would think is the middle of your world, but it isn't. This is 1000 by 1000 in its width and its depth. So what we're going to need to do is to change its position on the x-axis to be minus 500 and on the z-axis to be minus 500 as well. What that will now do is put the middle of the terrain in the middle of your world, which makes things an awful lot better for you. Then we're going to sculpt it. We're going to add some mountain ranges and some simple valleys, something to make this an interesting location for our cabin to sit on, and roughly in the middle of the map we're going to leave a relatively flat area for our cabin to go on. Up to you if you want the cabin to be on the top of a mountain, at the bottom of a valley, up to you, but I'm just going to show you the core tools that you've got. With the terrain tool selected, what we want here is this button, which is paint terrain, and then from the drop down we want to choose raise and lower terrain. I'm going to choose a nice brush. By default it'll be this round brush. We don't really want the round brush, we want something a little bit more organic. I kind of like this one, and then I'm going to zoom out and zoom out and zoom out. This, if you remember, is 1 kilometre by 1 kilometre. That's 1,000 metres either way. That's a long distance. This is enough to beat any map in any game you could conceivably make. You can reduce the brush size down, so you can see that's now a much smaller brush, and the opacity, which means how forceful the brush is. I'm going to have quite a soft brush. So I'm going to start by making some valleys and some mountains. I'm going to create quite a few, and you hear how I'm left clicking and dragging. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. I'm going to create a bit of a mountain range. That's probably too big. And it tells you down here, left click will raise, hold shift and left click will lower. So that mountain's too high, so I'm going to do shift on my keyboard and left click, and you can see that's bringing that mountain much further down. You will notice though, you can't go lower than your starting point. So you see there, I'm holding shift and left click, and it won't go lower than where we started. If you wanted to make a dip or a valley or a crater or anything like that, you always have to go up first. So if you wanted to go in and set it to a certain height, you can choose from the drop down set height, and I'm going to set the entire world to, let's say, 10 meters off the ground, and flatten tile. My whole tile is now 10 meters off the ground, and if I choose raise and lower again, I can press shift and now I can make a crater or a valley. So its minimum value is always 1. I'm not going to make a particularly pretty scene. Your job is to make something really nice. I'm imagining that there's going to be, if you've ever seen a cheesy 80s horror movie, we're going to have our cabin in the woods smack bang in the middle of these mountains over here, and we're going to have a road that leads out that way, something like that. Again, I'd have a few minutes to really practice that skill, give it a pause and make sure you're happy with that environment. Okay, once you've had a chance to use both of those tools, that's about sculpting and it's about placing. There are more advanced tools I'm just going to quickly show. So under the raise and lower terrain, you've also got set height, you've also got smooth height, where if you've got very sharp edges, so if I use a very sharp sculpting tool here, really small area, so if I have a really spiky area like that, you can use the smooth height, and that job is to kind of average that shape out to smooth it, to make it a little bit more round. Maybe that's desirable for you, maybe it's not. The other tools that we've got is paint holes. This is useful if you want to carve a cave into an area, or you want a hole for a lake. If I paint holes, you see how that's just chopping a hole through the map. Now that looks terrible by itself, but if you had an asset for the front of a cave or the entrance for a military base, that would go there in its place. I don't want that. I'm going to do Ctrl Z to undo it, but paint holes is a tool, and that's where we're going to leave it for now. We can make it more detailed as we get. Next thing is we're going to be placing the cabin asset and adjusting the scene if we need to. So I'm going to go into the, again, assets folder, into the cabin folder, into prefabs. If ever you use an asset from the asset store and you've got a choice between models and prefabs, prefabs is what you want. So in the prefabs folder, I'm going to drop the cabin in, and you can see just how very big our map is. This may be your first indication of going, actually, it's really empty around here, but remember you can rotate any objects that you like. So I'm just going to rotate the cabin maybe that direction. I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees, No, I'm not. I'm going to rotate it 120 degrees, just so its front in my case is pointing towards where I imagine the road might be. I'm going to select my terrain again, and I'm going to sculpt some more interesting lumps and bumps, because currently, raise and lower terrain, currently this is a bit too boring, so let's make some lumps and bumps. If you find that the lumps and bumps are too aggressive, just reduce the opacity down. You can download different packs for different sculpting tools, but we're keeping it really simple for now. So I'm just going to create an interesting little valley place. I'm going to lower that and smooth that down a bit. It doesn't look fantastic, but you get the idea. The more time you practice with it, the easier this will get. Obviously though, this looks really quite dull. We have placed the cabin asset and we've modified our terrain. Now we're going to make it look atmospheric. We're going to add a skybox to our scene. Now a skybox can also be an asset from the asset store. A skybox is literally a box that gets placed, well, where the sky is. By box it means it's got 6 sides, but you're looking at the inside of the box, not the outside of the box. If you go into the cabin folder again, assets and cabin, in there you will find prefabs. No, you won't. I've seen it in terrain, sorry. You will see sky by that person there, and you'll see the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pictures that make up the 6 sides of our box, and then you've got the skybox with its little icon there to say this is a skybox. You can see this skybox has got those 6 parts, and this is how easy it is to add a skybox. Okay, blink and you miss it. You watching? Drag, drop, sky. Suddenly that completely changes the tone of our map. You'll notice it became a bit more yellow as well. The lighting changed because the sky emits light in addition to our directional light. So our directional light, which is currently selected, doesn't matter where it is. All that matters is the rotation it's pointing at. If I go and find it, it might well be under the map. It's over here in my case, but if I double click on it, doesn't matter where it is. It doesn't even have to be above the ground, it just matters its rotation. But if you wanted to change the shadows, if I zoom out a little bit, again, it doesn't matter where it is. If I just rotated this around, you can see that you can get a nice day-night cycle effect. So if you wanted it to be set like in the dusk or the dawn, you can rotate that around. If you want nice long shadows, it just so happens I want my cabin quite dark. Maybe not that dark. You don't have to change the rotation to change the colour though, or change the intensity. You can change the intensity of the light, you can change the colour of the light. So if you wanted it change a different time of day, you can change the colour or whatever it is that you wanted. I'm going to keep it the default colour and probably keep it the default intensity so it's easier to see. So there's our cabin in the woods. However, it's a bit boring. And the problem is our terrain is still the default texture and it's really, really dull. We're going to add a grass texture and we're going to add trees and grass 3D models to it to spice up this terrain. So I'm going to go back to the terrain, and this time when I click the paint terrain option, I'm going to choose from the drop down paint texture, which I deliberately missed earlier. Paint texture. This is where you edit your terrain layers. Terrain layers in this context means texture, picture, thing you want to apply. Edit terrain layers, then we're going to create a layer, and then you choose from the list here what we want to be our texture. Now it just so happens there's one already in here called ground. I'm going to double click that and would you believe it, it's suddenly gone all grassy. That texture just so happens to be under the cabin folder. I think it's under prefabs, no, terrain, sorry, and it's that ground texture there is what we've just applied. But I want to talk about the reason why we've got 2 different ground textures, one which is green and one which is this pinky purpley blue thing. That is a normal map. That's why it's called ground_normal. This is a texture map, so this is designed to be an image that tessellates and repeats. So with our terrain selected, if I go back to our new layer which we've just created, so I'll click on that, you'll now see that the diffuse, which is the colour, is set to that green. The normal map isn't currently set to anything. The normal map, this pinky blue texture, that does a different job than the diffuse. That gives information to the lighting engine about how lumpy and bumpy it should be. So if I choose the select button next to normal map and I choose search for ground in the search bar, I've got my original diffuse texture, but I want the normal map. And it's subtle, but it's there. Let me show you the difference. If I set that to 0, we're going to have to zoom in real close to show you. But keep a close eye on this bit of the ground around here and watch what happens when I change the normal scale. You guys see that? I'm going to go way above too high so you can really see it. What the normal scale does is how much it's changing the lumps and the bumps that the normal map is informing it for. I'm going to set it back to 1. It's subtle, but it makes a difference. Okay. So we've added our grass texture. Easy as that. However, very rarely do you want your texture to be a solid colour. If we had more textures to choose from, we would edit our terrain layers, create a layer, and we would choose another texture. It just so happens in this package we don't have another one, but a texture is just an image. If you go on the internet and you find a mud texture, or you find a dirt texture, or you find a road texture, or you just walk outside and take a photo of some mud, you can then add that into your project and add that as another layer. Just for demonstration, I'm going to pick something that's really not well suited to this. I'm going to choose bark. This is obviously a texture for a tree, and I'm also going to with that selected, apply the bark normal map to it as well. Just to show you that you can now have 2 terrain layers on your palette and you can paint in them. So you see how I'm now painting with that second texture. You can have as many as you like, and you can change the opacity of that as you're painting it, and you can blend the two much more seamlessly than I'm doing. Really good if you want sand around the edge of some water, or you want mud around where people have walked, or you want some footsteps or something like that. Just showing you that that exists. And you can see that those layers get created and added into our scene. Now, trees. In the tree folder, you will find that there is a tree. You could, if you really wanted to, drag and drop that tree into your scene, and would you look at it, you've got some trees. That works, but that takes a lot of legwork. Watch also what happens if I decide to resculpt the area just beneath the tree. If I raise this up, you'll see that the ground moves, the tree doesn't. So it may not be the best option to physically place the trees that you want. What is a far better way of doing it is with your terrain selected, choose this option, which is paint trees. We're going to paint in trees here, just like we painted in grass and dirt. We're going to edit the trees, add a tree, and it will ask what tree do we want. Grab tree, drag and drop it there. Remember, this is under the cabin terrain tree folder. Dragged and dropped it into that slot, the tree prefab, and add. You can now paint in trees. Knock yourself out. Whoa, trees. Okay, it will go blue just while it recalculates, and you literally have as many as you like. Just like before, left click paints them, shift left click removes them, and hold control and click to erase only types of tree of the selected type. So just like I showed you with painting textures, you can have many textures, you can have many different types of tree, which is usually more desirable. However, let me show you the really lazy way of doing this. Mass place trees. How many trees do you want? 10,000? Yeah, go on then. Boom. 10,000 trees. If you find that they're not exactly where you would want them, you can then use the same tools we were using before. Shift left click to remove the ones you don't want, but notice what's different about using this technique. If I raise and lower my terrain and affect the tree, or the area where the tree is, it will move that tree up because it's part of the terrain. Obviously that's a bad example because it's not quite flush with the ground, but you get the idea. So that's how you add trees. Then we can do the same for little details. So that's how you paint trees. Again, you can have as many different trees as you wanted. You can just download trees from the asset store. Paint details. I'm going to add some details, edit detail mesh, and on here we're going to find our textures, leaves. Let's go with that then. I'm going to drag leaves into there. No, it's not leaves that we want. Just bear with me a second. It's not ground, it's not tree, because tree is just that. I'll show you the idea. I think leaves are what we're looking for. So what leaves are, it's a game object, it's a prefab. And what we're going to do is create that, unless it's under the prefab section. No, definitely isn't. So what we're going to do here is paint details, we're going to edit details, and we're going to add grass texture. Let's see if that's what we're looking for. Leaves. I don't think this is what I want. Oh, it is. Okay. So you can see by editing those details, and it was the add grass texture. I thought it was going to be a 3D model, thought it was going to be a mesh. So you can add details if you want rocks and stuff. You can add detail mesh and it will paint in rocks or whatever details you want. But adding the grass texture, you can then add your little details. Notice as well that these are billboards. What that means is, as you notice as I turn the camera around, it's just a simple image that's rotating to follow wherever the player is looking. It's a really simple way of adding a bit of detail. Sometimes it's not desirable, sometimes it is. Obviously, the more of these you add, the more it will hurt your performance. By performance, I mean frame rate. Just like we did before though, you can do a huge brush if you wanted to. I'm talking really, really big. Paint, and then zoom back in and you'll see that there's now a load of those little details. If I just go into the details though, so I'm double clicking on that leaf. Notice there's a bunch of properties here that you can play with. You can change the density, you can change the width, you can randomize certain things, whether it's billboarded or not. So now I've turned billboard off, they're not rotating to face us, which may not be ideal. You can change the tip color of the texture. So there's all sorts of different little properties that you've got, which just reminds me, if I'm going back to trees, you'll notice that you've got values here where you can randomize your tree settings if you really wanted to. So I'm going to mass place trees one more time. I don't want to keep the existing trees, and now you'll see they're far more randomized, which may be desirable, maybe it isn't. I'm just going to remove the ones I don't want, and the same for details. I'm going to smaller brush, and I'm going to remove the bits directly outside where people might walk. So we've now got an interesting environment where, again, we're not going to make it so we can walk through this map. It's not for playing, it's just about getting an interesting scene together. We've got a skybox, we've got our terrain, we've got our different features. So now we've got textures and foliage all fully working. Now it's about placing props. So your job is to now look into the prefabs area and think about making an interesting thing for our interesting thing for our cabin. Dependent on the tone of the game you imagine that you might be making with this scene, if you're making a horror game, you might want to consider about things being knocked over or damaged or broken. If you're making a game where this is just a location to explore, maybe you want to think about, well, that's where the player could go and rest their head and recover some health in your game. Notice I did a rotation there. I held down Control on my keyboard while I rotated. That snaps it to 15-degree increments, which really helps line things up. But think about how you could tell a story using these props. We could have a little stool by the side of it with a lantern on it. And you'll notice the lantern comes with a light, which obviously gives that wonderful yellow glow. It could be that you wanted a candle with that beautiful little light on it as well. Maybe the lantern is dangling from the ceiling rather than anything else. And if you find that you can't quite position things because these icons are getting in the way, you can turn those off. They're just gizmos, they're helper tools. You can turn those off with this button here. Toggle visibility of all gizmos. You can turn them on or off, or you can turn it on and just deselect light from that drop down if you wanted to. But that helps you position things. I'm just going to quickly tell a story with mine. I'm going to position the bed right by the door, I'm going to rotate it up a bit and that way a little bit. I'm going to imagine that someone tried to block the cabin. Maybe something went horribly wrong here. Maybe that's the story. And you can see you manually position things. Here's the things you absolutely want to check, and we will be checking for when we mark your work. Do any of your objects float? Now you'll notice right now I've got this really strange view. It's cutting things off right that are near me, and that's a really strange thing to do. What it's doing is it's not drawing things that are really close to the camera, it's culling them. Because we're in such a large world, it thinks that we don't want to see things that are really, really near to us. So the way you fix this is you click on any of your objects, double click on it in that case, and that will reset the scale, or you can click on something and press F to focus on it. That will help solve that problem if ever you have it. But here's what you need to check. Making sure that none of your 3D objects are at any point poking through things. You notice I've tried really carefully to make sure that is not poking through the wall. So that's your job now, is to tell a story with your log cabin. What can you do with the directional light to change its colour to really tell a story? What colour is the morning? What colour is the evening? The sky changes colour depending on what time of day it is. Maybe that's something you care about in telling your story. So this is all called narrative gameplay, telling a story through the environment. That's your job now for the remainder of the time, making sure that you're placing your props and you're doing your best to tell a story. What else can you do with assets from the asset store to add to this environment? Can you go on the asset store and find some rocks that you want to position? So if I search for rocks, for example, I only care about free stuff. Ooh, that's a nice looking rock. There's some nice boulders there. I'm going to grab that really quickly. It could be that this takes forever for me to demonstrate, and if it does I will abandon demonstrating it, but just showing you how easy this can be. For me it is a problem when I try and download things. I've got a problem with this machine. It may lock up while I try and import, we'll soon see. Hopefully it won't. But once it gets added to your project, it's nothing more than an asset. You'll get a new folder appear for any asset that you create, which you can then drag and drop into that paint foliage, or you can physically place it within your scene. Promising so far. Again, you can use any asset that you like. I'm going to import all of that. Keep in mind, when you're importing packages, keep an eye on the size. Your project right now, this project that you've got, a really simple, nothing going on, no gameplay going on project, is probably pushing 1 GB in size. Your projects will get big real quick. Most people's projects, their VR projects or their 3D projects, end up pushing 10 gig by the time they're done. So I've got rocks and boulders, rocks, prefabs, nice bunch of rocks. So I'm just going to paint some details. I'm going to edit details with a detail mesh, and I'm going to drag that rock in. Render component is missing. Interesting. May not like that particular one that I've just chosen. Didn't like that, but I'm just going to paint with this particular rock. You get the idea. There you go, it's just huge. If you do find that the rocks and things that you want to pull in are absolutely gargantuan, you can go into the actual model itself, double click into it, which will open it up, and you can rescale it if you want to. You can click this little button, so I want it to be half the size, 0.5, and that will set it all to 0.5. Again, there's nothing stopping you manually positioning things if you really want to. That will allow you to also rotate it to your heart's content. Go and make an interesting scene and let us know when you've done it.